So this video does come with a trigger warning because I am going to discuss child abuse. And even though I don't detail that, just the mention of child abuse may be harmful to some who have experienced some kind of abuse. So please protect yourself and skip this video if it feels right to do so. But I want to talk about this man and his victim, who was 11 years old. He told his victim to stay quiet or he would get in trouble. And that abuser is Andrew Paul Johnson, who was arrested in 2025 on abuse charges of this child. And so many of us know that this horrific story plays out in some form across the country every single day. The most vulnerable among us, victimized by those entrusted to care for them, nurture them, help them to become confident and empowered adults someday. Instead, those who should be mentors become the abusers, who groom the children for their own sick perversions, leaving scars that some victims find impossible to overcome. I know this story too well, and I know some of you do as well. That's why now at 64 years old, I pause when I hear about another child losing an integral part of their childhood innocence to a predator. It will change him in ways he simply cannot understand right now, but it doesn't have to be the end of his story. And I hope he's surrounded by people who will remind him that he did nothing wrong, that he didn't deserve this, that mom is sorry for trusting someone who didn't deserve that trust, that he is deeply loved and he will one day move past this pain, although he may never completely forget it. But also hidden inside this tragic story is something else, something more insidious and tragic that reveals a horrific truth about the value of the innocent, the vulnerable, those who should be the most cherished among us. Because what we now know is what Andrew knew in 2024 when he abused this child. Andrew knew that he would one day be the benefactor of a massive payout for his part in an insurrection. And I'm going to be honest, I hadn't read all of the stories about Johnson. I knew he was an insurrectionist, but I chose to skip the articles about Johnson's child abuse charges because for me it was just going to be another story. When I read so often about child abuse inside Christianity, this was just something I couldn't make space for at the time. And several of the insurrectionists have committed crimes after receiving their pardons for their participation in the January 6th insurrection. Given that the Trump regime uses words like patriots, victims, hostages, and political prisoners to describe the insurrectionists, one can say with a degree of certainty that none of the insurrectionists are sitting on therapist couches hoping to understand why they are a danger to society, to others, and more importantly, to children. Andrew Johnson certainly didn't. There's an article for NPR that talks about the timeline of Johnson's abuse. So we know in 2021 that he participated in the insurrection. And in 2023, Johnson meets the victim's mother, and she hopes that he'll help her fix things around the house, so she lets him sleep on the couch. That is when the abuse began of the child, who was 11 years old at the time. In 2024, Johnson is charged with the January 6th involvement. And in August of 2024, Johnson is sentenced to 1 year in prison. Now in January 25, Trump pardons the insurrectionists. Then in May of 25, Johnson posts that he expects to receive funds in restitution. He also re-enters the mother's life and continues the abuse of the child. In July of 25, the mother discovers the abuse of her son and one of her son's friends, and so she calls the police. In August of 25, Johnson is arrested, and in March of 26, Johnson is sentenced to prison for life. What I can't stop thinking about is what was going through that child's mind as he watched his abuser return to abuse him. If the abuse of this victim wasn't grotesquely horrific, Johnson also began abusing his 12-year-old friend, a girl who also trusted Johnson, who then in turn betrayed and violated her trust as well. And I want to pause here and focus on the victim's mother for a minute, because here you have a single mother hoping that her new friend would help her fix things around the house. She is equally a victim, but also a key component in how an abuser gains access to children. And while I don't want to excuse her disregarding the obvious stranger danger that should have made her more diligent in protecting her son, I also want to empathize with the needs of a woman desperate to find help for maintenance and upkeep on a home for her children. Because at one time I was that single mother with young children. Without the help of my family to repair the things in my tiny trailer or on my Chevette, I would have found myself stranded or my family cold on winter nights. But even with that help, I would often lie awake worried about how I was going to make ends meet and if the furnace was going to hold out one more winter. That stress is exhausting. Now, she eventually did notice the behavioral changes in her son that led her to dig into the messages between her son and Johnson. What she found was horrific, confirming her suspicions that her son was being abused. And she reported it immediately to the police. Her actions led to Johnson being arrested and fortunately imprisoned for life. But the woman who invited the predator into her home was eventually the one who ensured he'd spend the rest of his life in prison, hopefully far away from other potential victims. These similar paradoxes play out in family dynamics every single day when the enabler becomes the rescuer or sadly the protector becomes the abuser. It reflects how messy and complicated life is, but that woman learned a tragic lesson in hopes of making a better life for her and her children. Like I said, I won't excuse her lack of caution she should have used, but I also won't demonize her. She will most likely live with this guilt and regret the rest of her life. But a woman who did eventually notice subtle changes in her son's behavior that clued her into something being wrong is a woman who loves her children deeply. My only hope in prayer is that they are all receiving care and counseling to heal beyond the nightmare that was invited into their lives. But let's talk about what else is going on, because studies have shown that many Trump supporters respond to his accusatory language and dehumanizing rhetoric towards marginalized groups because of indoctrination that we are exposed to surrounding Christian patriarchy. Psychology and neuroscience increasingly shows us that support for Trump is often tied less to policy and more to emotional conditioning, identity protection, fear responses, and deeply embedded coping mechanisms. Trump's rhetoric tends to activate primal human instincts surrounding power, belonging, dominance, safety, grievance, and perceived threat. So for many people, especially those shaped by authoritarian or high-controlled systems like Christianity, the attachment is not simply political. It becomes psychological, emotional, cultural, and even spiritual. So this could also explain why a mother, who no doubt is herself a Trump supporter, deferred to a man with a proven propensity to violence, given his involvement in the January 6th insurrection. She and others like her may perversely trust a man with questionable character and moral depravity because Christian patriarchy teaches us to do so. And that's a tough reality for any of us who ignored those red flags, rationalized the warning signs, and sensed something was off, yet thought we were doing the noble thing of being in proximity to the one who can't and shouldn't be trusted. For the sake of her children and her well-being, I hope she fully deconstructs from this and is taking steps to protect her children from the harm it causes. So now let's talk about Christian patriarchy and how it's connected to January 6th, because this is what keeps sitting heavy in my spirit, as they say. It's not simply about these men who were pardoned. It is what they believed because they were pardoned. That NPR article paints a disturbing picture of people who already saw themselves as righteous victims of persecution. And then they were elevated into patriotic heroes by a president and movement willing to rewrite January 6th entirely. And somewhere in that process, some of these men appear to have absorbed the belief that consequences no longer apply to them. The victim was told to stay quiet, or Johnson would get in trouble. Johnson then mailed the victim an iPhone to entice him to stay silent. Then, according to an article on NBC News, he also told the child that since he was being pardoned, now get this, for storming the Capitol on January 6th, and he was going to receive a reward of $10 million as a result of being a January 6er, that he would be putting this child in his will to take any money he had left over. And I want you to let that sink in. A child who was a victim of sexual abuse was given an iPhone and told to remain silent or his abuser would get in trouble. Then he was promised an undetermined amount of money when his abuser died. Are we grasping the level of mental abuse that is happening here? The court, in deciding that Johnson should not ever be close to society again by sentencing him to life in prison, no doubt took into consideration the level of psychological deviance Johnson portrayed by placing a bond between him and his victim that could essentially last for years. decades even. Johnson knew the victim's mother was struggling financially. Johnson could easily surmise the children knew as well. They no doubt craved the trendiest clothes and the latest and greatest tech gadgets, which is why he purchased his victim the iPhone. Then, knowing that money was a big motivator for obedience, he dangled a proverbial carrot over this child's head that implied that Johnson deserved to be free because he could afford it, all while the victim struggled through life trying to heal from the abuse Johnson inflicted on him. The amount of rage I feel towards this man is unmatched. But this all matters, and that's why we have to talk about it. Because Johnson, and no doubt many of the other January 6 insurrectionists, already understood there was a culture forming around them that would reward loyalty, grievance, and violence instead of accountability. I need Christians who support this regime to hear me clearly when I say this. You do not get to scream "protect the children" while perpetuating movements that repeatedly protect dangerous men. You do not get to tell us children are the most sacred responsibility of a nation while silencing victims the moment their suffering becomes politically inconvenient. These children matter. And they matter beyond your selective outrage. When you scream about protecting the unborn, they mattered when they could be used to stir moral panic and outrage. But when actual children are harmed by men connected to your movement, suddenly the conversation shifts toward protecting the reputation of the movement itself. And what horrifies me is how recognizable this pattern is to so many of us who came out of Christian patriarchy. We were taught, directly or indirectly, that certain men were anointed, chosen, protected, untouchable. We were taught that preserving the authority structure mattered more than protecting vulnerable people inside that structure. We watched churches silence women and children to avoid scandal. We watched communities rally around abusive men because they were good Christian men who loved God, voted correctly, and held power. And now I watch the same conditioning unfolding politically. The same moral immunity, the same obsession with protecting hierarchy at all costs. I cannot ignore the hypocrisy surrounding law enforcement. These are the same circles that wrap themselves in the back the blue rhetoric for years. The same people who claimed reverence for police officers and law and order. Some of the very people now reframed as patriots assaulted police officers with rage and violence, and still the movement asks us to see them as victims instead. Law and order was never the point. Christian patriarchy was the point. Power was the point. Obedient to the right authority was the point. The moment officers stood between the mob and power, they became disposable too. And underneath all of this is something darker that deconstructing Christians eventually begin to recognize. And that is this: Christian patriarchy trains people to dehumanize anyone standing between them and what they believe they deserve. Women become obstacles, children become collateral damage, political opponents become enemies, police officers become traitors, and entire groups of people become less human the moment they interfere with power, entitlement, domination, or even desire. That is why so many people continue defending the indefensible even while victims sit right in front of them. And all I can do is keep thinking about these children, about how young they were, about how fear silences children when adults fail them. I keep thinking about how movements reveal who they truly are by what they say in church pulpits or political speeches, but also by who they protect when harm is exposed. Because saying you're protecting children is easy as an abstract slogan. Protecting children becomes much harder when it requires confronting the violent, entitled, authoritarian men inside that movement. Christians supporting abusive men have been conditioned to do so because they have remained silent in the face of abuse, or even worse, protected the abusers standing behind the pulpit or sleeping in their bedrooms. And now, 2 children will forever be scarred at the hands of an abuser who should have never been pardoned, should have never had access to them. 1 child abused is 1 child too many, but the people who see the abusive men of MAGA as heroes, they'll continue to invite them into their churches, or to stand behind the pulpit, or to sleep on their couches in hopes they'll fix things, or they'll marry them because they're good Christians, or they'll even elect them president because he's God ordained. And that cycle is endless. But if the least of these were truly the priority, just as Jesus instructed, that cycle would end. And for their sake, may it be so. I have a postscript to this video because as I was finishing this as a blog on Substack, I saw the daily writing from Heather Delaney Reese. And if you don't know who she is, she writes Hope for America on Substack. And she wrote, quote, "The Trump administration had begun scrubbing prosecution records tied to the people who attacked our Capitol, including one involving a man accused of assaulting police officers during the Capitol attack, who was also facing child solicitation charges." And here's what Heather's referencing. According to the Texas Tribune, Andrew Taki, I think that's how you say his name, had been previously charged with online solicitation of a minor stemming from a 2016 incident in which he allegedly sent sexually explicit messages to an undercover law enforcement officer who was posing as a 15-year-old girl. Yeah, that's your heroes. And they're getting paid to be terrorists now. As Timothy Snyder recently said in a video, he said, quote, "You see who will commit illegal acts of violence for you. You then try to make this legally costless for them. And finally, you pay them." And what that is exactly is what Trump has done. It's a model. It's immunized paid terrorists. It's familiar from earlier moments in history, from that of the leader and his war band. It's a model of government, entirely inconsistent with democracy, with a republic, with the rule of law. It's about immunized paid terrorists as a form of regime, end quote. Now, the people who are getting paid from this slush fund are also harming children. Anyone okay with this is standing on the wrong side of history, and by now, they clearly know it. You can find my writing, The Men They Call Heroes, on Substack, and be sure to follow me on all my platforms so we can stay connected should anything change where you are seeing this video.